The English Channel is a graveyard of ambitions, a volatile stretch of grey water that has dictated the fate of the British Isles more frequently than any monarch or parliament. On the night of November 25, 1120, the harbour of Barfleur was calm, the surface of the water deceptive in its stillness, masking the sharp submerged rocks of the Keelbuff just beyond the breakwater. Here, under a moonless sky, the trajectory of English history was violently recalibrated, not by a battlefield defeat, but by the hubris of a drunken crew and the structural fragility of a dynastic system that had failed to account for chance. The White Ship, a vessel widely considered the finest in the Norman fleet, was carrying William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I. The 17-year-old prince was the linchpin of the Norman Empire, the singular human guarantee that the union of England and Normandy would outlast its conquerors. By dawn, the ship was splintered timber, the heir was dead, and the illusion of Norman stability had drowned with him. The disaster was total, a forensic catastrophe that wiped out the flower of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy in minutes. 300 souls perished in the freezing brine, including the king's illegitimate children, earls, countesses, and the royal stewards. Yet, to understand the anarchy that followed, one must look past the manifest of the dead and focus on the survivor. Clinging to a floating spar in the biting cold was a butcher from Rouen named Berold, a man of no lineage and no consequence, clad in rough sheepskin that protected him where the fine silks of the nobility offered no warmth. While the princes and earls succumbed to hypothermia, the butcher survived to tell the tale. This chance survival serves as a grim metaphor for the era, the utter randomness of mortality, where the architecture of statehood can be dismantled by a single navigational error, leaving only the common observer to witness the ruin. Consequently, when the news reached King Henry I, the chroniclers report he collapsed to the floor in a heap of grief, never to smile again. This was not merely the sorrow of a father, it was the despair of a CEO realizing the corporation has been liquidated. The king understood instantly what his barons would take years to fully actualize. With William's death, the succession was a void, and in the 12th century, a political void was an invitation to violence. Driven by this horrifying realization, Henry spent the remaining 15 years of his reign engaged in a desperate, frantic attempt to engineer a solution where none existed. The Norman zeitgeist was fundamentally martial. The legitimacy of a ruler was inextricably tied to their ability to lead a cavalry charge and dispense justice from the saddle. The concept of a queen regnant was not just legally murky, it was psychologically alien to the feudal mind. The aristocracy viewed the state not as an abstraction, but as a physical extension of the king's body, strong, male, and capable of violence. Yet Henry, trapped by biology and time, had no choice but to force his daughter, the Empress Matilda, upon them. He recalled her from Germany, a widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, and made her the centerpiece of his survival strategy. In a solemn ceremony at Westminster in 1127, and again later at Northampton, Henry compelled his barons to swear oaths of fealty to Matilda. One can imagine the tension in that hall, the murmuring of men in chainmail, the reluctance in their eyes as they placed their hands on the holy relics. They swore the oath not out of loyalty to the concept of female rule, but out of fear of the old king's wrath. It was a performance of loyalty, hollow at its core, anchored only by the terrifying presence of Henry himself. Inevitably, the moment Henry died in 1135, the damp rot in the foundation was exposed. The transition of power in the medieval world required speed, presence, and the control of the treasury. Matilda, pregnant and residing in Anjou with her unpopular husband Geoffrey, was geographically and physically incapacitated. Had the wind in the Channel been different, or had she been closer to the coast, the history of England might have been rewritten by her arrival. Instead, the vacuum was filled by Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew. Stephen was everything the zeitgeist demanded: male, amiable, present, and willing to cut deals. He raced across the Channel, secured the support of London, a city that prioritized trade stability over dynastic purity, and seized the treasury at Winchester. The speed of his usurpation was breathtaking, a coup d'état executed before the king's body was even cold. The barons, released from the iron grip of Henry's personality, found it remarkably easy to forget their oaths to Matilda. They rationalized their treachery through the lens of expediency. Stephen was a man they could do business with, a known quantity who offered the path of least resistance. However, the tragedy of the anarchy lies in the fact that Stephen, while capable of seizing the throne, was constitutionally incapable of holding it. He was a man of soft edges in a hard age, possessing a chivalric nature that his contemporaries mistook for weakness. Consequently, the legitimacy of his rule remained fundamentally fractured. Matilda's party did not vanish, it entrenched itself, arguing with legalistic ferocity that an oath to God could not be unmade by the convenience of men. The conflict that erupted was not a war of swift battles and decisive outcomes, but a grinding, localized misery of sieges and skirmishes. It was a war of attrition where the primary weapon was not the sword, but the castle. Across the landscape, unlicensed Adulteran fortifications sprang up like poisonous mushrooms, unregulated by the crown, serving as bases for local warlords to terrorize the peasantry. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in the trembling hand of a monk witnessing the societal collapse, famously recorded that Christ and his saints slept. This was the psychological reality of the anarchy, a belief that the divine order had abandoned England, leaving it to the mercy of petty tyrants. The Civil War thus was the mathematical result of the White Ship. The equation was simple and brutal. A disputed succession plus a militarized aristocracy equals chaos. Every burned village, every suspended law, and every act of torture in the dungeons of these new castles can be traced back to that singular rock in the harbor of Barfleur. The structural weakness of the Norman inheritance laws meant that the system had no redundancy. When the backup generator failed, the lights went out across the kingdom. The aristocracy's resistance to female rule was not merely sexism, it was a pragmatic fear that a woman could not enforce the king's peace. Yet, ironically, by rejecting Matilda for Stephen, they ensured that no peace would be kept at all. Ultimately, the 19 years of winter that followed were a testament to the dangers of personalized power. The ghost of William Adelin hovered over every battlefield, a reminder of the fragility of high politics. When the war finally ended, not by victory, but by the exhaustion of a generation, the compromise reached that Stephen would rule for life, but Matilda's son, Henry I, would succeed him, was an admission that the usurper had been a placeholder all along. The Angevin Empire that arose from the ashes of this failure was forged in the fires of this failure, creating a legal and administrative machine designed specifically to ensure that the whims of chance and the gender of an heir would never again destroy the state. Today, beneath the calm waters of the English Channel, the wreckage of the White Ship is long gone, consumed by the tide and time, but the lesson remains embedded in the DNA of the British Constitution. Stability is not a gift of nature, but a construct of law. easily shattered when the succession is left to the mercy of the waves. The winter of 1135 arrived in Normandy, not with the gradual cooling of the season, but with the sudden, catastrophic silence that follows the death of a tyrant. When Henry I breathed his last after a surfeit of lampreys, the administrative machinery of the Anglo-Norman realm, which had been forged in iron for 35 years, ground to a terrifying halt. This was not merely a political transition, it was a psychological abyss. The medieval mind abhorred a vacuum, equating the absence of a consecrated king with the immediate onset of biblical chaos. The collective anxiety of the era was palpable, a dread that permeated everything, from the hushed conversations of the canon lawyers to the frozen fields of the peasantry. They did not fear war so much as they feared the absence of law, for Henry's lion of justice persona had suppressed the baron's predatory instincts only through the consistent application of terror. Consequently, when the king's eyes closed, the immediate instinct of the ruling class was not loyalty to the oath they had sworn to Henry's daughter, the Empress Matilda, but a desperate, pragmatic scramble for continuity. They needed a king, and they needed him immediately. Driven by this overwhelming necessity, the fate of England was decided not by the slow deliberation of a council, but by the velocity of a single man. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, was in Boulogne when the news broke. Had the winds of the English Channel turned against him that first week of December, had a winter gale kept his ships in port for even 3 days, the history of the British Isles would have been written by the House of Anjou decades earlier. Instead, the weather held. Stephen crossed the narrow sea with a speed that suggested divine providence to his supporters and unnatural ambition to his detractors. He did not march on London, he raced toward it, understanding that in the mechanics of usurpation, possession of the ground is worth more than 1,000 legal arguments. He arrived at the gates of the city while the rest of the aristocracy was still paralyzed by the news of the old king's death. The Londoners, terrified of the anarchy that a disputed succession might bring, opened their gates, proclaiming him king by acclamation. It was a decision born of fear, a frantic attempt to bolt the door against the coming storm. Yet a king proclaimed by a mob is not a king anointed by God. To transform this opportunistic seizure into a legitimate reign, Stephen required the church, and specifically his brother, Henry of Blois, the Bishop of Winchester. Here, the forensic evidence of the coup becomes clear. We can trace the transaction in the speed with which the royal treasury at Winchester was surrendered, a vast stockpile of silver pennies that Henry I had hoarded for a generation. Bishop Henry did not merely unlock the doors, he unlocked the conscience of the realm. To circumvent the inconvenient fact that the entire nobility had sworn solemn oaths to support Matilda, the church hierarchy engaged in a breathtaking act of theological gymnastics. They argued that the oaths had been coerced, or that they were invalid, or that Henry I had changed his mind on his deathbed. Hugh Bigod, the royal steward, swore on the Holy Gospels that the dying king had released his barons from their vows. It was a perjury so convenient it acts as the pivot point of the era. Consequently, on St. Stephen's Day, Stephen was crowned at Westminster. The holy oil was applied, the prayers were said, and the usurpation was sanctified. The tragedy of Stephen's reign, however, was written into the very terms of his accession. He had not taken the throne by right of blood or right of conquest, but by right of purchase. To secure the loyalty of the wavering barons, he was forced to bargain away the very prerogatives that made a king powerful. He granted the Charter of Liberties, promising to respect the church's jurisdiction and relax the royal grip on the forests.
Inevitably, this created a dynamic where the king's authority existed only as long as he could afford to pay for it. A grim reality settled over the court. Stephen was a king who could not command, but only request. We can see this erosion in the surviving writs from the early years of his reign, documents that move from the imperative tone of his predecessor to a language of negotiation and concession. He was stripping the plating off the ship of state to keep the engines running. While Stephen was busy purchasing a brittle loyalty, the rightful heir, Empress Matilda, remained in Anjou. Her delay is often criticized by historians as hesitation, but it was likely a calculation of gravity. She was pregnant, and she was a woman in a world that viewed female rule as an aberration of nature. She waited, letting the initial euphoria of Stephen's coronation fade into the hangover of governance. She understood that Stephen's power was wide but shallow. When she finally acted, it was not with a massive invasion force, but with a surgical strike at the king's legitimacy. Her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, formally renounced his allegiance to Stephen in 1138, citing the king's failure to uphold the law, a direct consequence of the concessions Stephen had been forced to make. The causality loop was closing. The very means Stephen used to gain the throne were now the reasons he was losing it. The tension broke in September 1139. Matilda landed at Arundel with only 140 knights, a force so small it seemed suicidal. Yet her arrival shattered the illusion of Stephen's control. The country did not rise against her, it fractured. One specific moment illustrates the tragedy of the common man caught in this dynastic feud. In a village near Wallingford, a local miller, whose name is lost to the tax rolls, but whose fate represents thousands, found himself grinding grain for Stephen's mercenaries in the morning and Matilda's knights in the evening. When the lines of battle shifted, he was hanged by the retreating force for collaboration. His death, unrecorded in the great chronicles, was the true cost of the Civil War. The breakdown of royal authority meant that local lords were free to settle private scores under the guise of supporting one claimant or the other. As the chapter of Stephen's undisputed reign closed, the landscape of England began to physically change. Without a central power to forbid it, barons began to build unlicensed fortifications, the adulterine castles. They rose on hilltops and at river crossings, crude motte and bailey structures that were not designed to defend the realm, but to oppress the countryside. These earthworks, many of which survive today as grassy mounds in the corner of English fields, are the enduring scars of the usurpation. They are the physical manifestation of the bargain Stephen made, peace for today, purchased with the order of tomorrow. The monarchy had survived the death of Henry I, but the state had collapsed, replaced by a feudal free-for-all, where the only law was the distance an arrow could fly. The usurpation of necessity had birthed the anarchy of ambition.
By the winter of 1140, the psychological landscape of England had fractured as violently as its political borders. This was no longer merely a dynastic dispute between cousins, Stephen of Blois and the Empress Matilda, but a descent into a collective apocalyptic dread. The zeitgeist of the mid-12th century was defined by a terrifying realization. The divine order, which mandated that a king's peace was the earthly reflection of God's will, had simply evaporated. Men and women did not just fear death, they feared the metaphysical void of a kingdom without a head. Driven by this existential panic, the populace retreated into localized survivalism, watching as the grand chess game of royal succession devolved into a muddy, bloody free-for-all. It was a time when the horizon itself seemed to promise only burning thatch and the hoofbeats of mercenaries, creating a pervasive atmosphere of inevitability where the only certainty was the erosion of law. The pivotal rupture occurred at Lincoln in February 1141. Stephen, a man possessed of immense personal bravery but plagued by strategic myopia, laid siege to Lincoln Castle. Inevitably, this aggression drew the forces of Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, to the relief of the garrison. The battle that followed was determined not by numbers, but by the rigidity of feudal honor. When the front lines collapsed, Stephen's advisors urged a tactical retreat, a standard maneuver that would have preserved the king's liberty to fight another day. Had Stephen withdrawn, the war might have remained a fluid contest of maneuver. Instead, bound by a chivalric code that viewed retreat as anathema to kingship, he stood his ground. The fighting was visceral and chaotic. Chroniclers describe the king swinging his Danish axe until it shattered, then drawing his sword until it too broke, fighting with the desperation of a man already aware of his fate. He was overwhelmed, captured, and led away in chains, a sight that shattered the mystique of the anointed monarch. Consequently, the central pillar of the English state was removed, leaving a vacuum that Matilda was all too eager, yet fatally unprepared to fill. With Stephen imprisoned in Bristol, the path to the throne seemed clear for the Empress, yet her ascendancy revealed the fragility of political momentum. She adopted the title Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English, a designation found on charters surmised to have been drafted during her brief weeks of supremacy. However, her approach to governance was rooted in the rigid imperialism of her German marriage rather than the transactional compromise required of English feudalism. Upon arriving in London, she did not court the powerful merchant guilds, but demanded tallages, punitive taxes, as if she were a conqueror in a foreign land. This miscalculation was catastrophic. The psychological state of London was not submissive, it was volatile, fueled by the presence of Stephen's queen, Matilda of Boulogne, who raised an army across the river in Kent. Driven by the Empress's arrogance, the city's bells rang out in a synchronized alarm, and the citizens rose in a fury that the chroniclers likened to a swarm of angry bees. The Empress was forced to flee the capital before her coronation could take place, leaving her dinner untouched on the table, a forensic detail that underscores the chaotic immediacy of her failure. The pendulum of power, having swung violently toward the Angevin cause, immediately careened back during the rout of Winchester. In her retreat, the Empress attempted to besiege the Bishop of Winchester, Henry of Blois, whose shifting allegiances acted as a barometer for the war's instability. The hunter became the prey. Stephen's loyalists, bolstered by the London militia, cut off the Empress's supplies. In the desperate flight that ensued, Robert of Gloucester, the military architect of the Empress's cause, was captured covering her escape. This event restored a grim symmetry to the conflict. A king was held by the Empress's commander was held by the Queen. Inevitably, a trade was arranged, Stephen for Robert. The board was reset to the status quo ante, but the pieces were damaged, and the kingdom they fought over was barely recognizable. This strategic stalemate birthed the true horror of the anarchy, the proliferation of the adulterine castle. With neither monarch able to enforce a monopoly on violence, local magnates began to construct unlicensed fortifications. These were not the grand stone keeps of later centuries, but hasty Motte and Bailey structures, timber towers erected on mounds of earth thrown up by forced peasant labor. Archaeological evidence from sites in the fens reveals the temporary nature of these forts, yet their impact was permanent. They acted as nodal points of tyranny from which robber barons terrorized the surrounding countryside. The collapse of the judicial system meant that these local lords were judge, jury, and executioner. A simple farmer, perhaps named Aelred, living in the shadow of such a castle, found his existence reduced to a calculus of terror.
His grain was seized not for tax, but for plunder. His sons were conscripted to dig ditches, and his localized world shrank to the distance a horseman could ride in a day. For Aelred and thousands like him, the dynastic arguments of Stephen and Matilda were irrelevant abstractions compared to the visceral reality of the garrison down the road. The Peterborough Chronicle offers the most forensic and harrowing account of this societal decomposition. It records that men said openly that Christ and his saints slept, a theological indictment of the era's hopelessness. The chronicler details specific torture methods with the detachment of a coroner. Men were hung by their thumbs until their joints burst, or suspended over slow fires to extract non-existent silver. This was not random sadism, it was the logical outcome of a distinctive economic collapse. With the currency debased and agricultural production interrupted by scorched earth tactics, wealth could only be acquired through extraction. The devils and evil men described in the texts were often desperate knights trying to fund their own survival in a war that had ceased to pay them. The rule of law had been replaced by the law of leverage. Ultimately, the war settled into a grinding attrition that neither side could win. The geography of England fractured into spheres of influence, Stephen holding the east and the southeast, Matilda the west, with a vast lawless no-man's land in between. The legacy of this period was a profound trauma in the English psyche regarding disputed successions and weak central authority. It was this specific chaos, the memory of the smoke rising from the villages of the Midlands, and the complete failure of the royal writ that paved the way for the legal revolution of the next generation. The intricate bureaucratic machinery of the common law, established by Henry II, was not born of abstract philosophy, but a direct, desperate immune response to the infection of the anarchy. The desire for a single, enforceable king's peace was so great that it would eventually strip the barons of their private fortresses and lay the foundations for the centralized state that governs the island to this day.
By the winter of 1153, the Kingdom of England was not merely divided, it was dissolving under the weight of a paralysis that had lasted 19 long years. The chroniclers of the age, men cloistered in stone cells, listening to the rain and the rumors of burning villages, had ceased to write of glory and had begun instead to write of the apocalypse, famously recording that Christ and his saints slept. This was the Anarchy, a civil war between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda, that had devolved from a dynastic dispute into a localized, grinding breakdown of law. The landscape itself bore the scars of this stalemate, dotted with illicit fortifications known as adulterine castles, hastily erected timber moats from which robber barons terrorized the peasantry, accountable to neither king nor empress. The collective psychological state of the realm was no longer defined by martial fervor or feudal loyalty, but by a profound, suffocating exhaustion. The nobility, having spent 2 decades oscillating between sides to preserve their estates, had lost the taste for decisive battles. They had become addicted to the status quo, a chaotic equilibrium where the absence of a strong monarch allowed them to rule their own fiefdoms like petty kings. Into this atmosphere of entrenched cynicism sailed Henry Fitz-Empress, the son of Matilda and the Count of Anjou. He was 20 years old, possessed of a frenetic, bull-like energy that terrified his courtiers, a man who refused to sit during councils and whose hands were forever busy with hunting hawks or legal scrolls. Driven by the sheer vitality of his Angevin blood, Henry did not come merely to raid, as he had in his youth, but to dismantle the logic of the Civil War itself. He moved with a speed that baffled the aging King Stephen,
crossing the channel in a storm that would have kept lesser men in harbor, landing with a mercenary force that was small but disciplined. Consequently, the momentum of the war shifted almost overnight, not because of the size of the armies, but because Henry represented a terrifying inevitability. He was the future rushing in to meet a past that was too tired to defend itself. The collision course led to Wallingford Castle, a strategic fortress on the Thames that had held out for the Empress for years, now besieged by Stephen's forces, who had erected a counter-castle, a malvoisin, or bad neighbor, to starve the defenders out. Henry approached from the west to relieve the siege, and Stephen marched to meet him. The stage was set for the cataclysmic battle that the realm had avoided for a generation. The armies drew up on opposite banks of the Thames, the gray water swirling between them, swollen by the winter rains. Tension tightened the air. Pikes were lowered, shields were locked. The fate of the dynasty hung on the order to charge. But the order never came. In a moment that defies the standard narrative of medieval bloodlust, the machinery of war simply ground to a halt. The leading magnates of both armies, men who were often related by blood or marriage, lowered their weapons and refused to engage. This was the rebellion of the weary. As recorded by the chroniclers, the barons judged it foolish to settle the kingdom's status by a single battle, fearing that a total victory for either Stephen or Henry would result in a king strong enough to revoke the liberties they had seized during the chaos. Driven by this cynical pragmatism, they forced the two leaders to talk. It is a moment of profound counterfactual tension. Had a single arrow loosed by a nervous archer sparked a melee, Henry might have died in the mud of the Thames Valley, and the Plantagenet dynasty, which would shape English law and culture for 300 years, would have been strangled in its cradle. Instead of slaughter, there was silence. A negotiation began across the narrow stretch of water. We can zoom in here on the human cost of this delay. Consider a nameless man-at-arms in Stephen's retinue, perhaps a 19-year-old conscript from the fens, standing in the freezing mud with rusted mail biting into his shoulder. He does not care about the succession. He cares only that the harvest is ruined, and that if he dies here, his family will starve. For him, and thousands like him, the grand strategy of the barons was a reprieve granted by the weather and the whims of powerful men who viewed his life as a currency to be hoarded or spent. The standoff at Wallingford was not a triumph of pacifism, but a cold calculation by the aristocracy that peace had finally become more profitable than war. However, one man rejected this logic: Eustace, King Stephen's eldest son and heir. Eustace was the embodiment of the war party, a man who had grown up knowing nothing but conflict and who viewed compromise as disinheritance. Furious at his father's capitulation to the negotiations, Eustace left the camp in a blind rage, riding east to ravage the lands of the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. He was the primary obstacle to peace, the variable that could not be solved by equation. Then, fate, or perhaps biology, intervened with brutal efficiency. Within weeks of the standoff, Eustace was dead. The chroniclers called it the wrath of St. Edmund, struck down for plundering the church. Modern forensics might suggest a gastrointestinal illness, or perhaps poison. Regardless of the cause, the effect was absolute. With Eustace gone, the spine of King Stephen's ambition snapped. Stephen was a man broken by time. He had lost his wife, his best commanders, and now his heir. The fight drained out of him, leaving only a hollow shell of a monarch who wished only to die in his bed. Consequently, the path to the Treaty of Winchester was cleared not by diplomacy, but by grief. In November 1153, in the drafty cathedral city, the final act was performed. It was an act of legal fiction that saved face for everyone involved. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would adopt Henry as his son and heir, bypassing his remaining biological surviving son, William. The documents sealed that day were specific, detailed, and binding. They did not just end a war, they reconstructed a state. The two men rode together through the streets of Winchester, the old king and the young duke, amidst the cheers of a populace that was cheering not for a victor, but for the cessation of terror. The mercenaries were paid off and sent home. The adulterine castles, those symbols of the anarchy, were slated for demolition. The sword refused at Wallingford had proven more powerful than the sword swung. As Henry assumed the reins of administration, acting as the de facto ruler even before Stephen's death the following year, he began to lay the groundwork for a centralized legal system, the common law, that sought to ensure that the whims of barons would never again supersede the king's peace. Legacy is often forged in these quiet rooms of compromise rather than on the battlefield. The centralized state that Henry II would build, rising from the ashes of Stephen's failure, established the principle that the law is a unified force superior to local custom and feudal power. Every time a modern court cites a precedent or a citizen relies on the uniform application of justice, they are unknowingly pulling on a thread that leads back to the muddy banks of the Thames in 1153, where an army refused to fight and forced a kingdom to heal itself. The Peace of Wallingford was the victory of exhaustion over pride, a pragmatic settlement that birthed an empire.
By the winter of 1153, the Kingdom of England was not merely fractured, it was suffering from a profound collective psychological exhaustion. The chroniclers of the age, usually prone to hyperbole, recorded the mood with a stark, forensic depression, noting that the peasantry believed Christ and his saints slept. This was the zeitgeist of the anarchy, a pervasive hopelessness where the horizon promised nothing but burning thatch and stolen livestock. Driven by this spiritual fatigue, the baronial classes, who had spent 19 years oscillating between the rival claims of Stephen and Matilda, finally reached a breaking point. They were no longer motivated by loyalty or greed, but by a desperate need for stasis. It was this universal weariness, rather than any brilliant military maneuver, that forced the issue at Wallingford. The armies, facing each other across the frozen mud of the Thames Valley, simply refused to fight. Consequently, the kings were compelled to talk not by the strength of their swords, but by the silence of their soldiers. The resulting Treaty of Wallingford was a masterclass in pragmatic ambiguity, yet its existence hung on a singular, fragile thread of fate. Had King Stephen's son, Eustace of Boulogne, a man of martial fury and little diplomatic grace, not succumbed to a sudden violent seizure at the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds just months prior, the negotiations would have collapsed. Eustace was the obstacle, the guarantor of continued war. His death, viewed by the superstitious populace as divine judgment for his plundering of church lands, removed the biological imperative for Stephen to continue the struggle. Without an heir to fight for, Stephen's will disintegrated. Inevitably, the treaty that emerged in November 1153 recognized Henry,
the young Duke of Normandy, as Stephen's adopted son and successor, turning a dynastic rival into a legal heir. The parchment was signed, but the peace was tenuous, resting entirely on the failing health of an old king and the restraint of a young, ambitious duke. When Stephen died in October 1154, the transition of power defied the chaotic precedent of the previous 2 decades. Henry II did not rush across the Channel in a panic of legitimacy. He waited 6 weeks for favorable winds, a delay that signaled a terrifying confidence. He arrived not as a claimant, but as an inevitability. The England he stepped into was a ruin of governance, a landscape dotted with addle-treen castles, unlicensed fortifications built by local warlords during the chaos to terrorize the countryside. These stone tumors were the physical manifestation of the anarchy. Henry understood that to restore the crown, he had to destroy the architecture of feudal independence. Driven by a cold administrative fury, he ordered the demolition of these castles. The work was brutal and swift. In every shire, the sound of the era shifted from the clash of steel to the dull thud of masonry hammers dismantling the unauthorized keeps, reducing the symbols of local tyranny to piles of rubble. Simultaneously, Henry moved to purge the human element of the chaos. For years, England had been the playground of foreign mercenaries, particularly the Flemish routiers, commanded by men like William of Ypres. These soldiers, loyal only to gold and devoid of local ties, were the muscle behind the anarchy's atrocities. Henry's decree was absolute. They were to vanish. We can imagine the scene through the eyes of a nameless Flemish archer, a man who had lived fat on English plunder for a decade, now standing on the docks of Dover in the driving rain, stripped of his stolen lands and forced back across the narrow sea. With his departure, and the departure of thousands like him, the private armies that had sustained the Civil War evaporated. The king was reclaiming the monopoly on violence. However, Henry realized that tearing down castles was merely a physical correction. The true reconstruction had to be intellectual. The anarchy had proven that a decentralized system relied too heavily on the character of local lords, many of whom had turned into petty despots. Consequently, Henry sought to replace the arbitrary justice of the barons with a standardized royal justice. This was the birth of the common law, a system designed to be common to all, overriding local custom and feudal whim. The legal machinery he constructed was revolutionary. In the Assize of Clarendon in 1166, he established the jury of presentment, the ancestor of the modern grand jury, shifting the burden of accusation from the victim to the community. No longer would a crime be a private matter between families. It was now a breach of the king's peace. This shift required a new class of men, not warriors, but administrators. The exchequer, which had ceased to function effectively under Stephen, was revived with obsessive detail. We see the evidence of this bureaucratic resurrection in the pipe rolls, long scrolls of sheepskin recording every penny owed to the crown. A specific entry from the 2nd year of Henry's reign shows the cost of wax for the sealing of writs, a mundane detail that signifies a profound shift. The government was no longer run from the saddle of a warhorse, but from the quiet, dust-mote-filled rooms of the Exchequer at Westminster. The pen was being sharpened to ensure the sword remained sheathed. The genius of Henry's reforms lay in their insidious appeal. By offering a royal writ, a writ of right, or a writ of novel dispossession, he gave the minor landholders a mechanism to resolve disputes without resorting to violence. If a baron seized a knight's land, the knight no longer had to lay siege to the baron's castle. He could purchase a royal writ that commanded the sheriff to impanel a jury and determine the truth. Driven by self-interest, the populace began to turn toward the king's courts and away from the baronial courts. Inevitably, the power of the feudal lords eroded, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they became legally irrelevant. The king had outflanked them with procedure. The legacy of the anarchy was therefore ironic. The total breakdown of order in the mid-12th century necessitated the creation of the most robust legal system in Europe to replace it. The chaos of Stephen's reign proved that the personal presence of the king was insufficient to govern a complex realm. Governance needed to become a machine that could function even when the monarch was absent. Henry II, often physically absent in his continental domains, built exactly that machine. Today, when a lawyer in a London court cites a precedent or a judge instructs a jury, they are activating the gears of a mechanism designed 8 centuries ago to prevent England from ever slipping again into the darkness of the 19 winters. The Iron Peace was not just a cessation of hostilities, it was the imposition of a logic so durable that it outlived the stone castles it was built to dismantle.